Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L coming in to cover Eden Zero, Chapter 109, Red Cave. Now, I know that I haven't done Eden Zero in a very long time. I think last time I talked about it was back when it started. But yeah, Eden Zero. This is one of the manga series I keep up with, and it's got an anime adaptation coming. So figured it's probably a good time to just get back onto Eden Zero and talk more about it because there are some cool little things that Hiro Mashima is doing. For those that don't know, well, actually, you should know this if you're at chapter 109. But Eden Zero is the manga by the Fairy Tail creator. It's got a few more shenanigans going on, like with the mysteries. Oh, apologies. The mysteries with all the things going on with the time travel and all that. It's kind of interesting. I am kind of curious as to whether or not it's going to be a bit of a train wreck, or if there's going to be a point where the premise just kind of collapses in on itself because it became too big. I do wonder if that's going to happen eventually, and I also wonder if like Hiro Mashima is just going to be able to like drive it in a safe way such that everything stays stable. But it's been a really fun manga, and this week's chapter 109, I think is really interesting. I think there's some spots here that's kind of interesting to look at. In this week's chapter, we also ended off with meeting Laguna again. And as you guys recall, he is, if you're following the series, again, I assume you're following the series if you're at 109, but he was from the Drac and Joe arc. He was the guy with water, and at the end of the chapter, we find out that he's being called the Water Spirit. So that feels pretty cool to me. Like we already knew he had a pretty interesting power set, what with being able to trap people and everything if they cried. Like, that was a very interesting power set when you think about it. Like it's kind of those arbitrary JoJo powers, which is also kind of funny because he looks like a JoJo character. So giving him a bigger designation because I don't think he was called Water Spirit before. That's pretty cool. If he was called Water Spirit, my apologies. It's been a while. I don't really fully remember those little details. But yeah, how we're gonna do this, I don't recall what else I want to talk about. Like this was the chapter we got properly introduced to Nadia. So Nadia is also a bit of an interesting thing. We'll analyze her as we go through the pages, however. So I'll do a page by page walkthrough, and any things that pop up, I'll let you know. But on page one, what we ultimately find out here, this is just a reestablishing page, and we just had Rebecca following up on the whole thing with the corpse. Now I have some ideas about the corpse, not the identity of the corpse, but there's something at the end of the chapter that I think is rather interesting. So we'll move on there. Anyway, on the first page, what we really find out is that Nadia is an old model. She repeats this multiple times, and that she's holding onto a cable. On page two, one of the big details that I think is interesting is finding out that Nadia was made 200 years ago to protect the mother beacon. That's interesting. It's interesting. So this pathway to mother has existed for 200 years. That's what I find the most interesting thing here. That's relatively young in the grand scheme of things. So interesting to find out that little bit of a detail. Really, anything that comes down to giving us a timeline is always going to be a worthwhile detail to have. I guess what's also really interesting in the fact that she's been there for 200 years is that she seems pretty sophisticated for an android. So it's actually pretty interesting. Like, android technology in some ways has moved a lot and hasn't really moved all that much. Like, 200 years ago, the limitation was she needs to be tethered to a power supply. And now in the current era, like we have androids that can just move wherever. That's a pretty interesting drop. A pretty interesting jump in technologies. Now, page 4 is the interesting page because page 4 comes in with a lot of information. First off, we find out that there was also a treasure. But here's where things get interesting. When you saw on page 3, she had said, I was built 200 years ago to protect the mother beacon. Then you go to page 4, and then she says, and yet the treasure I am here to guard was lost long ago. So you said that you're there to guard the beacon. You said that the treasure that you're there to guard is gone. And then you said that the beacon that leads to Mother remains. Do you see like just a little bit of the issue there with the wording? There's a treasure, there's a beacon, and she's there to protect both. And then she says that she's doesn't have anything to guard. I think that's just a little bit that like I don't know. Am I overthinking it? Like, I think it's just an issue with the translation on the fan site. That must be what it is. But it's just kind of funny that it's so messy. Honestly, when you keep following the panel, so you can kind of tell that there's a little bit of trickery going on with probably like how this was to translate, because in the next panel Rebecca's saying, you mean the treasure and the clue to finding mother are two different things? So already we went from a situation where we have the mother beacon, we have a treasure, which is a physical thing, and then we have, though that physical thing, the treasure, has been lost, the beacon leads to mother remains, and then you have wait, the treasure and the clue. So clue switches things from just a physical object to the possibility of a intellectual object kind of thing, right? So it's really interesting. And beacon, like just from definition there, right? A beacon doesn't need to be a physical thing. A beacon could just be like a trail of light that's just being emanated from here, or like a map, like some kind of star map that's inside of a room. So it's just kind of interesting how we went all like. It's interesting how it's kind of like they're moving the goalposts just within 2 pages. I really do wonder, just for the fan translation, if the fan translators just kind of struggled with trying to get the meaning in these particular pages. They're very confusing. At the end of the day, though, the treasure has been taken. The fact that they can still get to mother, though, probably means that the treasure wasn't important in getting to mother. They're not the same thing. It's just really interesting. I do want to see what form this is going to shape, because this is just not very clear. And I can only imagine, like, with how hard it is to translate Japanese in general with different meanings for the same kind of symbols. I'm very interested to see what exactly this shakes out to being. Anyway, this page also does something for Nadia in that it creates a moment of vulnerability, which is also very interesting because, like, right after this, she has menacing images, which isn't really hard to tell if that's just Mashima being a showman. Like, is he just making the images happen just to make the scene more dramatic, just to play up with the atmosphere in the scene. But yeah, no, seeing that little moment of vulnerability was adorable. If Nadia turns out to be insidious after this, that little moment of vulnerability will definitely go a long way in like making her feel like a more nuanced character. Or and it wouldn't be like hardcore nuance. This would be like surface level nuance. It's like, oh yeah, she's a hardcore villain, but she's adorable when she trips over, right? Usually when a villain wants to be taken seriously, you don't really give them moments where they trip over, because that's more of an adorable factor there. Anyway, we go into page 5, I believe, and on this page is just Nadia telling us that they're not guaranteed to survive, and then that's where you have a more menacing shot. You have her still smiling, but it looks a little bit creepier. That said, when you go into page 6, you have her again speaking kindly. Like, she's at this point, when you take everything there, when you take these pages together, you really come out thinking, well, Nadia might just be neutral in general. Like, she doesn't really particularly care maybe about the people that are going in. She's just there to do her guiding job. Whether or not people live or die, this is part of the job kind of thing, probably. That's kind of the characterization that can really pull out of it, just because of the way that the art's expressing the character. Now, the next couple of pages are just pretty much exposition pages as we go inside of the cave. So first off, in terms of the environment, I think the environment's really cool. When I see that environment, honestly, it makes me feel like the feel I get is like prehistoric, center of the earth kind of thing. Like if you were watching Land Before Time, I think the Land Before Time movies had a bit where they went to the center of the earth. Anyway, the flora that we're seeing there makes sense to me if you were to tell me, oh, this is like the flora that you would see in a volcanic shaft. That makes sense to me. Also, across these pages, one of my favorite things was definitely the image of Homura just having a really hard time with the heat. They did set up or remind us that earlier in the beach portion that Homura had trouble with the heat because she was making comments about it. But yeah, it was a super cute image of Homura for this page. And then in the next couple pages, we go into just showing us what's going on with Red Cave, and we see the namesake. Now, what I found interesting with Red Cave is that we saw it activate when Homura went in there, and then that told us that the settings of Red Cave is dependent on people going further into the cave. And then we had a very interesting thing on page 13 that confirmed that observation, being that Wise said the fire field is following him. So what does that mean, that a field of fire is following Shiki as he goes in deeper into the cave? Well, that's a pretty interesting little mechanism going on there, right? It does seem that this is relative to the person's progress. So most likely, the deeper you go, the harder it's going to get to get to wherever you're going, which is pretty interesting. Pretty interesting that we have a cave that is so adaptive. I do wonder if there's a way to play trickery here, like if you have someone leading forward and then someone coming behind who's not getting the full effects, right? Because the fire field is following Shiki, but everyone else isn't being enveloped by the fire the way he is. And the fact that it's following makes it kind of feel like part of it's leaving where it was already occupying. Of course, after that, we have things getting worse with the magma coming up and then eventually the guys running out of there. So overall, the mechanisms within the cave I think are pretty interesting, and it makes it more exciting to like try and figure out how exactly are we going to get past this when we come into the future chapters. Anyway, with that portion of Red Cave sorted, we have the powwow where everyone comes together just to talk about what's going on. Now on page, I think it's 15, the big thing here is that Nadia tells us that Ziggy obtained the beacon 15 years ago. Which, again, really interesting, right? Like, is the beacon the treasure? Like, it's just so unclear. But yeah, okay. He obtained the beacon 15 years ago. 15 years ago lines up with when Hermit said that they went to Red Planet before. So that's cool. That makes sense. You know, I read them thinking, okay, Ziggy took the beacon when they went through there the first time. All right, and then we have Ziggy made it through the magma. That's pretty cool. Now, that was the last little bit for Naughty. That was really interesting. And after that page, we see that Witch has already gone ahead to Blue Garden, taking advantage of fast travel. And once at Blue Garden, we ultimately see that she ends up in front of Laguna. Only other thing I want to say before we go into the Laguna portion is that people, like, Eden Zero fans are always very funny whenever they point out Witch looking good. I mean, like, it's a nice dress, but it's always funny that everyone kind of unifies on the idea that Witch just looks good. Anyway, we end up with Laguna being recruited, and we have the whole thing with the Spirit of Water. Honestly, Spirit of Water really just makes me feel like Laguna is more grand than he might initially seem, and it makes me feel like Laguna has more powers. Like, if Laguna comes in here and says he can become one with water, I'll be like, all right, you call him the Spirit of Water. That feels right. That feels right, right? Now, what I actually found very interesting is specifically the song that Laguna was singing for his little play. Now, you know, in the real world, if you were doing this in a real world scenario with real world logic, like this exact scenario of Thingamabob Witch going in there to find Laguna and he's singing a song, there's no reason in the real world to expect that song's gonna be relevant. But this is a story. This is a construction by a human mind. You come into this thing and you have Laguna singing, "Come what may, I'll be back one day, for this is the place I call home. I'll never forget this bright blue planet." And then you have, "Come what may, I'll be back here. This is the promise I give you." I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, is Laguna going to be in a position where this rhetoric is going to reflect on some kind of interaction with Nadia? Because think about it. You have a situation where there's a guy, he's dead. He comes back to this planet. He has, his love is Nadia. Would it be hard to say that this guy and Nadia had an exchange that went something along the lines of he promised to her that he would be back one day, and then look, he makes it back, although he's dead, he makes it back. You know, when you also have Laguna like talking about a bright blue planet, I know that also applies to Blue Garden. That could very well apply to Red Cave as well. So, seeing that there's this rhetoric that Laguna is introduced with, he's singing a song, he's in a story about a guy that promises to come back one day, a woman that isn't sure whether or not she can believe him, and then it's ultimately a promise. And then you look at what's happening with Nadia, I definitely feel like, at the very least, Laguna could come in and talk to her and use this song as a point of reference. Or at the very least, this might foreshadow some of the issues that occurred with Nadia and the dead person. I wouldn't be surprised. It's just too coincidental to be talking about people that promise to meet each other one day when you have one coming back from space, right? Like, it feels too on the nose. So as we go into the future, I'm kind of hoping to see some kind of connection there. I am kind of hoping to see some kind of callback there. Anyway, any other things to go for here? No, honestly, that was the biggest part of the chapter for me. Like, I'm most interested in the song and to see if Mashima decides to connect the song to the events with Nadia's love life. And then when we actually meet Laguna, I think another interesting thing just with meeting him was how he looks like a very stereotypical actor when he's in his disguise. That looks like an actor's face, you know. That was just really cool to see. But yeah, no, man, aside from little details, I don't think I got anything else I want to say. And in terms of little details, it'd just be little background details. There's not really much else. For chapter 109 of Eden Zero, what I'm most excited about, honestly, it's, well, like, you know, how are we going to get past the puzzle? Honestly, I think we're going to get past the puzzle. It's just a mechanism of how. I feel with Laguna, who can manipulate water to such a degree and manipulate people into water to such a degree, I feel like there's all kinds of tomfoolery he can pull off. But yeah, I'm most excited to see if that little play he was putting on, if that's what's going to inform Nadia's perspective. Anyway, super interesting stuff. Guys, let me know what you thought down below. Let me know if you got any ideas, and let's call it there. Till next time. Hope you have an absolutely great day.